My brother did not ask me to co-sign his truck. He ordered me to. His text arrived at 7:36 on a rainy Wednesday morning in Baltimore, while I was standing in my kitchen with one hand around a coffee mug and the other flipping through marine insurance files for work. No hello, no please, no explanation. Just 6 words. You'll co-sign my new truck. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. That was Jason. My brother never requested help like a normal person. He announced a disaster, waited for everyone to panic, and then acted offended when someone asked why he had created the disaster in the first place. I typed back 2 words. Dream on. 10 minutes later, my mother answered for him. All capital letters. Orfis, ando Urixit off ram famiel eviance. I remember looking out at the rain sliding down the window and feeling something inside me go quiet. Not numb. Not broken. Just quiet. Like the part of me that always rushed to defend, explain, soften, and rescue had finally stepped away from the controls. My name is Lisa Bennett. I was 34 years old then, and I made my living investigating suspicious marine insurance claims. My job had taught me one thing better than anything else. People lie most confidently when they believe no one will check the paperwork. For years, I checked everyone's paperwork except my family's. That ended the morning my brother demanded a truck. Jason already had a car. It was an older sedan with a dented rear bumper, but it ran. It started every morning. It got him to work. It was not glamorous enough for him, which in my family was apparently the same thing as an emergency. He wanted a black luxury pickup, the kind that looked less like transportation and more like an announcement. A culker had bought one. Jason felt embarrassed. Jason feeling embarrassed had always been treated like a family crisis. My mother, Linda Bennett, had built an entire emotional religion around protecting Jason from consequences. If he lost a job, the boss was unfair. If he crashed a car, the road was dangerous. If he owed money, life had been hard on him. If I said no, I was selfish, cold, changed by success, or too suspicious because of my work. The truth was simple. Jason had been rescued so many times that he had mistaken rescue for a right. Years earlier, I had opened a business credit line to help my mother's catering company. She had come to my dining room table with red eyes and trembling hands, saying the oven had failed. 2 clients were late with payments, and she might not make payroll. I was younger then, more hopeful, still desperate to the daughter who proved love with usefulness. So I signed. The credit line was in my name. I was the guarantor. My mother and Jason were authorized users for business emergencies, only equipment repairs, vendor deposits. Short-term cash flow, nothing personal, nothing secret. That was the agreement. But after Jason's text and my mother's threat, I opened the bank portal for the first time in months, and saw enough to make my stomach turn. I called the bank before I even finished my coffee. I removed Jason as an authorized user. Then I removed my mother. I canceled every linked card. I froze the available balance. The woman from the bank asked, very carefully, "Do you understand that all authorized users will lose access immediately?" "Yes," I said. "Would you like to provide a reason?" I looked at Jason's text again. Unauthorized risk. The next morning, I woke up to 63 missed calls. 21 from my mother. More than 30 from Jason. 2 from a dealership manager. The rest were relatives who apparently had been drafted into the war before breakfast. Jason left one voicemail. "You have no idea what you just did." He sounded furious, not scared. Furious, as if I had stolen something from him by refusing to let him steal from me. At 8018, I listened to the dealership manager's message. His tone was polite in that strained way professionals use when they know they have been dragged into a family mess. Jason had attempted to put an $11,800 down payment on the new truck using the credit line. He had already negotiated the vehicle. He had signed preliminary paperwork. He had represented the account as money available to him. In other words, he had created a public embarrassment first, expecting me to step in to make the embarrassment disappear. That had always been his method. Make the mess loud. Make sure witnesses are present. Then hand the bill to the person most likely to avoid a scene. Usually, that person was me. Not that day. I called the bank's fraud department instead of calling Jason. The representative confirmed 3 attempted transactions in the previous 24 hours. The dealership deposit, a payment to a debt consolidation company, and a transfer to an unfamiliar account. All 3 had failed after the freeze. Then she said, "Emmons Bennett, you should review your statements." "How far back?" I asked. "At least 18 months. I downloaded them all. Line by line, the truth appeared in neat columns: restaurants, gas stations, cash advances, personal debt payments, sporting deposits hidden through payment services. None of it had anything to do with catering. My mother had made payments just large enough to avoid default. The balance had climbed above $34,000. The statements had been going to an old business email account my mother controlled from the year I helped establish the credit line. I had trusted her to tell me if something changed. She only told me when the spending stopped. When she called again, I answered on speaker. The statements were spread across my kitchen island like evidence bags. Lisa, thank God, she said. There has been a misunderstanding. No, I said. There has been $34,000 of understanding that you kept away from me. Silence. Then came the voice. The soft, wounded voice my mother used when she imagined witnesses around her. Your brother has been struggling. With my credit. I was protecting his dignity. With my credit. With family resources. She snapped. It is not a family account. It is mine. She sighed, deep and disappointed, like I had failed a moral exam. That attitude is exactly why people think you've changed. Within an hour, I discovered who people were. My aunt texted to ask why I had shut down my mother's business. A cousin wanted to know why I had left Jason without transportation. An uncle said I needed to remember who supported me before I became successful. By noon, the family group chat had become a courtroom where I was the defendant and my mother was both victim and judge. Jason wrote, Lisa got promoted and forgot where she came from. My mother wrote, her career has made her suspicious of everyone. I typed 3 answers and deleted them all, so I stopped arguing. I exported every statement. I changed the password to the old business email. I saved screenshots. I created a folder on my laptop labeled BNITCRIDE EVDNCE. At 1:00 afternoon, my supervisor Renee Walsh called me into her office. Renee had known me for 6 years. She knew my work, my habits, and the way I documented everything twice because dishonest claims rarely came with clean edges. Her office overlooked the harbor, but that day her blinds were half closed. A legal folder sat on her desk. Lisa, she said, we received a complaint. The complaint accused me of abusing confidential information, intimidating financially vulnerable people, and using my position for personal revenge. The sender claimed to be a former client, but gave no claim number, no vessel name, no policy number, no date, and no verifiable identity. The wording was strangely familiar. Too familiar. It copied phrases from my company biography and from the text message Jason had sent my mother that morning. Jason had moved beyond family gossip. He was attacking my career. Renee believed the complaint looked suspicious, but company policy required a review. Until it was resolved, I would be removed from 2 major investigations. At 2:06, Jason texted me. This can all stop when you fix the credit line. I took a screenshot. Then I replied, thank you for putting that in writing. The typing dots appeared, vanished, appeared again. Then nothing. That was the moment my guilt died. Not dramatically. Not with screaming. It simply stopped breathing. Because this was no longer about a truck. It was about how far my brother and mother would go, because they believed I would rather bleed quietly than make them explain themselves. 2 nights later, Jason came to my townhouse. It was 9:12 p.m. My doorbell camera recorded him walking up the steps, staring into the lens and covering it with his palm. He forgot about the side camera above the garage. He pounded on the front door hard enough to rattle the framed pictures in my hallway. Lisa, open up. We're settling this tonight. I stood barefoot on the hardwood, phone in hand. Leave the property. I'm not a stranger. I'm your brother. Then behave like one. He hit the door again. Mom lost a catering contract because her card got declined. I'm about to lose my job because I don't have reliable transportation. You're treating this like one of your investigations. It became an investigation when you used my credit without permission and filed a false complaint with my employer. He went quiet. I don't know what you're talking about. You used the phrase financially vulnerable people in your message to Mom and in the complaint. You're paranoid. Then you won't mind explaining it to my attorney. For 1 second, I thought he might leave. Instead, he kicked a ceramic planter into my railing, ripped my house number plaque from the wall, and threw it onto the walkway. Open the door, he shouted. You don't get to destroy my future and hide behind lawyers. I dialed emergency services when he grabbed the handle and slammed his shoulder against the door. I'm calling the police, I warned. Call them, he yelled. I'll tell them you stole family money. That sentence clarified everything. Jason believed confidence could replace evidence because in our family it always had. Mom repeated his version. Relatives accepted it. Anyone who questioned him became the villain. But police reports were not family dinners. Bank records did not cry on command. I activated every security camera in the house. Which family money did I steal? I asked through the door. The credit line. Mom built that business. She built the catering company. I guaranteed the account. She paid it. She paid minimums after you spent it. Red and blue lights flashed at the end of the street. Jason changed instantly. His shoulders relaxed. His voice softened. He raised his hands like he had been the calm one all along. He told the officers we were having a family disagreement, and that I had become emotional. I showed them the recordings before opening the door. The footage showed him covering the camera, damaging my property, striking the door, and threatening to accuse me of theft. He was not arrested that night because he had not entered the house and the damage was limited, but the officers issued a trespass warning and created a report. I chose documentation over immediate charges. It was not mercy. It was a timeline. As the officers walked him back toward the old sedan, he claimed I had left him without. He turned and said, "You're going to regret making this public." I answered, "You made it public when you contacted my employer." The next morning, my mother called me cruel for involving police in a private misunderstanding. She never asked if I had been scared inside my own home. That was my mother's pattern. Her concern flowed toward the person causing damage, never the person expected to absorb it. At work, Renee told me the anonymous complaint came from an internet network linked to Jason's employer, Chesapeake Marine Supply. Their legal department sent a preservation notice. Jason sold marine engines and navigation equipment to many of the same marina operators who knew me professionally. By using company systems to spread lies about me, he had dragged his employer into the mess. Soon, his manager discovered that Jason had searched the customer database for businesses connected to my cases. He had told coworkers I was unstable, under criminal investigation, and likely to lose a professional license I did not even hold. By Friday afternoon, he was suspended. My mother called immediately. "This has gone too far." "I agree." "Then tell his employer you misunderstood." "I didn't." He could lose his job. He used company information to target my clients. He was upset. Being upset explains a feeling. It does not erase a decision. She accused me of enjoying his downfall. For a moment, that accusation touched the old bruise inside me. The daughter she trained to confuse guilt with love still lived somewhere in my chest. But then I looked at the dent in my front door and the broken planter on my porch. "I'm not enjoying it," I said. "I'm simply not preventing it." That night, someone scratched the words "GRIEDLAR" across my garage door. The side camera captured a hooded figure and part of a vehicle with a distinctive dent on the rear bumper. Jason's sedan had the same dent. This time, I filed a formal police report. Then I opened the oldest financial records I could find. If Jason was willing to threaten my home and career over one frozen account, I needed to know what else that account was hiding. That is when I called Amy Mercer. Amy was not the kind of friend who told people everything would be fine. She was a forensic accountant, which meant she spent her days finding money people insisted did not exist. When I showed her the statements, she opened her laptop and asked one question. "How far back can we go?" We spent Saturday at her dining room table, surrounded by folders, old invoices, tax documents, family event records, coffee cups, highlighters, and enough printed statements to make the table sag. By noon, we had identified 3 patterns. The first pattern was Jason. For almost 4 years, he had treated the business credit line like his private emergency fund. Rest or repairs, cash advances, debts. Whenever the balance got dangerous, my mother made minimum payments from catering revenue. When the catering account was short, she transferred money from another account labeled Bennett Family Heritage Committee. The Heritage Committee was supposed to pay for reunions, memorial donations, graduation gifts, holiday help, and support for elderly relatives. Family members contributed every year because they trusted my mother. The second pattern was fake catering expenses. My mother recorded payments to vendors that did not exist, then transferred similar amounts to Jason. Some names resembled companies that had closed years earlier. Amy found 12 suspicious entries totaling more than $19,000. The third pattern was me. 5 years earlier, my mother told me she needed money for emergency surgery. I sent $8,000 and organized a family collection. The surgery was real, but insurance had covered most of it. The extra donations were never returned or disclosed. 3 weeks later, Jason paid off a repossession balance and moved into a new apartment. I remembered canceling a vacation that year. I remembered emptying part of an investment account. I remembered apologizing to my mother because I could not give more. I sat there staring at the printouts, and for once I did not cry. The discovery felt too precise for tears. My mother had not merely favored Jason. She had built a financial system around protecting him, and she had used my reliability as collateral. Amy found one more piece. The attempted $1,950 transfer from the day I froze the account was tied to my L's registered in my mother's name. Harbor Family Events LLC. It had no website, no public customers, and no real business presence. Yet money from the Heritage Committee, the catering company, and the credit line had passed through it. One memo read, "JB Vehicle Program." Jason had not suddenly demanded a truck. They had been preparing for months. Their plan was to use my credit line for the down payment, pressure me into co-signing, and classify the truck as a business expense under my mother's LLC while Jason used it personally. If he defaulted, I would carry the debt. The 10 minutes between Jason's demand and my mother's threat had not been an emotional reaction. It was coordination. I asked Amy, why would they risk something this obvious? She looked at me with the sadness of someone who had seen this pattern too many times. Because it worked before. People become careless when they mistake someone's patience for permanent permission. We created a timeline showing each major transfer, fake vendor, and payment linked to Jason's debts. I sent copies to my attorney and the bank investigator. My attorney told me knock public accusations until every record was verified, but she also told me to remove my name from every family account and demand of the counting of the Heritage Fund. Before I left Amy's house, we found a draft email in the old business inbox. It had never been sent. It was addressed to several relatives. The message said that I had agreed to guarantee Jason's new work vehicle as my contribution, after being unavailable for family responsibilities. I read it twice. My mother had announced my consent before asking me. She had planned to make my refusal look like betrayal, after everyone already believed I had said yes. That evening, my uncle called. My mother had scheduled what she called a family accountability dinner for Sunday. She wanted me to explain why I had endangered her business and Jason's job. Nearly 30 relatives were expected, including people who had donated to the Heritage Fund. My uncle sounded uncomfortable when he invited me. I said, I'll be there. He paused. Linda said you were afraid to face everyone. I'm not afraid. I told him. I was waiting until I knew what to bring. My mother held the dinner in a church banquet room where she had catered weddings, memorials, graduations, and holiday events for years. The location was deliberate. It was her stage. She placed old family photographs near the entrance. She put a donation basket beside a sign for the next Bennett reunion. Jason stood near the buffet table, wearing a new blazer and waiting for my apology. By then, his suspension had become a termination. Chesapeake Marine Supply had confirmed that he used company systems to submit the anonymous complaint, access customer records, and contact people connected to my cases. Jason told relatives I had pressured the company to fire him. My mother had also lost 2 catering contracts. She claimed I destroyed her business. The truth was that she still had another bank account and another card. Both were simply near their limits. I arrived with a slim binder and a flash drive. Amy sat quietly in the back. My attorney had warned me not to turn the evening into a screaming match. Present verified facts. Correct false statements. Give the committee members access to their records. Let them decide what to do next. After dinner, my mother tapped her glass with a spoon. We are here because this family is hurting, she began. Lisa's choices have affected all of us. She said Jason needed a dependable work vehicle. She said, I had previously agreed to support the family through our shared credit arrangement. She said I froze the account without warning, humiliated him at the dealership, damaged her catering business, and interfered with his employer. Jason stood, one hand pressed to his chest like he was giving testimony. I'm not perfect, he said, but I didn't deserve to lose my job because my sister wanted revenge. The word was useful. Revenge made every consequence sound like something I invented. Then my mother turned to me with that small, wounded smile. Lisa, would you like to explain yourself? I carried the binder to the front. My hands were steady. First question, I said. Wu here knew the shared credit line was legally mine. No one raised a hand. My mother said, that is a technicality. It is the first fact. I said. I explained that I had opened the line in 2018 to save her catering business. I was the guarantor. She and Jason were authorized users. The agreement permitted business purchases with disclosure of personal charges. I placed copies of the contract on the table. Over 18 months. I said more than $34,000 was spent or advanced. Most of it had nothing to do with catering. It included restaurants, betting deposits, personal debts, cash withdrawals, and Jason's expenses. Jason laughed loudly. She's making personal spending sound criminal. I haven't called it criminal, I said. I called it unauthorized. My mother lifted her chin. I approve the spending. You were not authorized to approve it on my behalf. I made the payments. Some of them. Then I connected the flash drive to the television. A transaction timeline appeared on the screen. The rest came from the Bennett Family Heritage Committee. The room changed instantly. Until that moment, people could pretend this was a sibling fight, but the heritage money belonged to everyone who had contributed. My great-aunt Eleanor leaned forward so fast her purse slid off her lap. What do you mean? She asked. At least 27 transfers moved from the heritage account into Mom's catering company or her new LLC. Several were followed by payments toward Jason's personal charges. My mother's face tightened. They were reimbursements for events. I displayed 12 supposed vendors alongside registration results, showing that several did not exist or had closed years earlier. A forensic accountant reviewed these entries, I said. Anyone who contributed has the right to request a full accounting. My Uncle Mark looked directly at my mother. Linda, did you use memorial funds to pay Jason's debts? My mother's expression hardened. I moved money where the family needed it. That isn't what I asked, he said. Jason stepped forward. Everyone benefited from Mom's work. Lisa is acting like a prosecutor because she hates seeing anyone else get help. I looked at him. You told the dealership I had agreed to co-sign. You would have if you weren't selfish. That is not an answer, he scoffed. You always help eventually. The room went still. There it was. Not a misunderstanding, not confusion. An expectation. He had not believed I said yes. He had believed my no would not survive pressure. I displayed the dealership report showing the attempted 800 charge. Then the draft email where my mother announced my supposed agreement before I had given it. My mother stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. You read my private email. It was stored in the business account, connected to the credit line, I guarantee, I said. And it shows you announced my consent before asking me. She turned to the relatives. I was trying to make something positive happen for my son. Is that a crime? My Aunt Carol stood. You told me the reunion fund was short because catering costs increased. You asked me for another $2,000. I planned to replace it. My mother said. With what? Carol asked. My mother had no reply. Voices rose around the room. People demanded statements. Someone asked whether graduation gifts had been reduced to cover missing money. Great Aunt Eleanor began to cry because she had contributed from a fixed income. My mother's reputation did not collapse in one dramatic explosion. It dissolved transaction by transaction. Jason grabbed the remote and turned off the television. Enough, he said. You wanted to embarrass us. Congratulations. I wanted the threats and lies to stop. You got me fired. You used your employer's database to target my clients because you would not listen when I said no. He moved close enough that two relatives stepped between us. You cut off Mom's business. You sent police after me. You turned everyone against us. I canceled access to my credit, I said. Your employer reviewed your conduct. Police reviewed the camera footage. The family reviewed the records. I did not create those facts. My mother sank into a chair. For the first time in my life, she could not control which version people believed. I placed a sealed envelope in front of her. This is a formal demand for accounting and repayment of unauthorized charges. My attorney has sent copies to the necessary parties. I am removing my name from every account, contract, and business document connected to you, or Jason. She stared at the envelope like it was alive. You would sue your own mother. I hope disclosure and repayment make litigation unnecessary. Oh, she whispered. So you're choosing money over family? No, I said. I am refusing to let money be the price of belonging. A great Aunt Eleanor reached into the donation basket and removed her envelope. Then Aunt Carol did the same. Within minutes, the basket was empty. Relatives asked Uncle Mark to become temporary treasurer. The church administrator, who had been standing near the doorway pretending not to listen, informed my mother that future events would require payment in advance. Jason stormed out and slammed the door. No one followed him. Before I left, my mother looked at me and said, "You'll regret the day you did this." I put the original agreement back into my binder. No, I said. I regret how long I waited. At 8:15 the following morning, 1 week after the dealership charge failed, the bank permanently closed the shared credit line. My credit remained intact. Jason's truck agreement was canceled. My mother's accounts entered review. The Heritage Committee froze all withdrawals. This time, my phone was almost silent. Consequences came through certified letters, canceled contracts, declined applications, and conversations no one could control with tears. Jason remained unemployed for months. His former employer documented his misuse of customer information, which made it difficult for him to find another sales job in the regional boating industry. The dealership kept part of his reservation fee because he had misrepresented his financing. He sold expensive electronics, gave up his apartment, and moved back into our mother's house. The black pickup went to another buyer. My mother lost access to the church venue and 2 preferred vendors. During the accounting review, vendors discovered late invoices and conflicting payment records. Several clients requested deposits back after learning event money had been mixed with unrelated accounts. The Heritage Committee appointed my uncle and 2 cousins as administrators. They found more than $31,000 in undocumented transfers over 5 years. Some had supported genuine emergencies. Many had benefited Jason without disclosure. My mother agreed to sell unused catering equipment and enter a repayment plan. If she had refused, relatives were prepared to take civil action. For the first time, she had to explain herself without me standing beside her to soften the truth. My employer completed its review and cleared me. The investigators confirmed the complaint was false and came from a network associated with Jason's workplace. Renee restored my cases, and the company informed affected clients that the allegation against me was malicious and unsupported. One of those clients later referred a major commercial fraud case to us. My work on that case led to a promotion. I did not celebrate Jason's failure, but I did celebrate that his lie had not become my identity. Family events changed. Thanksgiving moved to my uncle's house. I was invited, but I declined that year. Distance was not punishment. It was recovery. I needed silence from people who had treated truth as an inconvenience. Some relatives accused me of going too far. Others apologized for believing the first story they heard. I accepted the apologies without pretending trust returned immediately. Anyone can regret being wrong after documents appear. Trust requires different behavior before the next crisis. 5 months after the church dinner, Jason emailed me. The subject line said, "No excuses." He admitted filing the complaint, contacting my clients, and assuming I would eventually sign the loan. He wrote that he resented my stability because it made his failures look like choices. He said every time I rescued him, he felt relief first, then shame. Instead of facing the shame, he blamed me. He did not ask for money. He did not ask me to call his former employer. He said he had taken a warehouse job and entered a debt management program. His final line read, "I thought being your brother meant you couldn't let me fall. I understand now that I kept jumping because I believed you had to catch me." It was the first apology he had ever given me that named specific actions and did not contain the word "but." I waited a week before replying. "I acknowledge your apology. I am not ready to resume our previous relationship. There will be no shared accounts, loans, employment interventions, or unannounced visits. Future contact depends on consistent behavior, not promises." He replied with one word, "Understood?" My mother took longer. For months, her messages were about repayment records, tax documents, and committee questions. Shortly before my 35th birthday, she mailed me a handwritten letter. In it, she admitted she had confused protection with love. After my father died, she had been terrified that Jason would collapse if anyone allowed him to fail. Each time she covered a debt, invented an excuse, or pressured me to help, she told herself she was preserving the family. Instead, she divided us into roles. Jason created emergencies. She managed the story. I paid the cost. She admitted redirecting the surgery donations because she feared Jason would lose his apartment and job. Rather than tell the truth, she used her illness because she knew no one would question it. The letter ended with a sentence I read 3 times. "I taught him that consequences were cruelty, and I taught you that love meant compliance. I harmed both of you differently." That sentence mattered more than tears. It showed she understood the system, not only the outcome. Still, I did not rush to forgive her. We met at a public cafe near Canton Square on a bright Saturday morning. She arrived early, wearing a beige coat and carrying a folder with both hands. She looked smaller than I remembered, not because she had aged overnight, but because she was not surrounded by people repeating her version. She brought proof of 6 repayment installments and documents, showing that Harbor Family Events LLC had been closed. "I'm not asking you to trust me today," she said. "I'm asking whether I can keep earning the chance." I told her my conditions: no financial requests, no relatives used as messengers, no threats involving holidays, funerals, or family events, no sharing my private information, no rewriting what Jason did. If any condition was broken, contact would stop again. She nodded. "I understand." I watched her carefully. "Do you understand?" I asked. "Or are you agreeing because you are afraid I'll leave?" "Both," she said. "But fear is not your responsibility to fix." Over the next year, Jason kept his warehouse job, made debt payments, and eventually became a shift supervisor. He still drove the repaired sedan he had once called embarrassing. My mother rebuilt a smaller catering service using cash deposits and transparent bookkeeping overseen by an outside accountant. Her events were fewer. Her reputation was quieter. Her life became less comfortable, but more honest. That was the true price they paid. Not merely lost jobs, money, contracts, or reputation. They lost the belief that I would always protect them from themselves. A year after the credit line closed, I attended my first family gathering since the accountability dinner. It was held at my uncle's house in Towson. There was no donation basket by the entrance. A printed committee report sat on a side table for anyone who wanted to review it. My mother arrived with 2 trays of food she had already paid to prepare. She did not organize the event or control the guest list. When relatives asked about her repayment plan, she answered without changing the subject. Jason arrived in his old sedan. He greeted me politely and did not force a private conversation. Later, while we cleared plates in the kitchen, he mentioned that he had saved enough money to replace the transmission if it failed. "That sounds responsible," I said. He gave an embarrassed smile. It sounds slower than having someone co-signed. Slower isn't always worse. No, he said. Sometimes slower is the first time it's actually yours. We were not suddenly close. I did not erase the complaint, the threats, the garage door, or the night he tried to force his way into my home. Forgiveness did not mean restoring his previous access. It meant releasing the need to relive the injury, while allowing evidence, not guilt, to determine the future. Before I left, my mother asked whether she could call the following week. She asked. She did not announce. The difference sounded small, but families are often rebuilt through small differs repeated consistently. Freezing the credit line did not destroy my family. It exposed the version of family we had been protecting, one where the most responsible person carried the greatest burden, one where the loudest person received the most help, one where love was measured by how much damage someone was willing to absorb. For years, I believed saying no made me selfish. Every time I rescued Jason, I helped him postpone adulthood. Every time I surrendered to my mother's threats, I taught her that fear worked. Enabling did not prevent the family from breaking. It allowed a broken pattern to continue without being named. Boundaries are not walls built to punish people. They are doors with conditions for entry. Respect the home, tell the truth, accept responsibility, then the door may remain open. Threaten, exploit, or manipulate, and the person inside has every right to close it. Temporary separation can also be an act of care. It gave me enough silence to hear my own judgment without their panic speaking over it. Not every family changes after consequences. Some people lose access and spend their lives blaming the person who finally said no. Reconciliation should never be promised simply because someone apologizes. Real change appears in records, routines, repaired damage, respected limits, and months of behavior no one has to demand. My family did not return to what it had been. That was the victory. We built something smaller, less sentimental, and more truthful. I was no longer the emergency account, the automatic co-signer, or the daughter expected to purchase her seat at the table. I was simply Lisa, a sister and daughter who could love people without financing their denial. At 8:15 that Wednesday morning, 3 missed calls made me believe I had caused a catastrophe. What I had really done was stop interrupting one. Sometimes the consequence a family fears most is the only thing powerful enough to teach it a lesson. And sometimes the person called cruel is simply the first person brave enough to stop paying for everyone else's choices.